Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. Welcome back to another episode of the John Morris Show. This one I'm going to be answering the question, should I learn PHP or Node.JS? So this is another question I saw over on Quora that's getting a lot of attention. Wanted to address it because I think that's sort of a popular topic right now, and if you're coming up in web development, this can be a little bit of a tricky question. So the further detail of the question was after having learned JavaScript, which is actually an important part of this. But after having learned JavaScript, I'm now ready to move on to learning a server-side language. Should I learn PHP/Python/Rails next or Node.JS, seeing that I have already spent time learning JavaScript and it'll be easier using the same language server-side? So I'm going to get into that. I'm going to talk about it from several different perspectives. Before I get into this whole thing, I just want to make clear that I'm not going to tell you what you should do. So I'm just going to give you the information. I'm going to tell you my opinion, and I'm going to talk about what I did. But at the end of the day, you have to look at all of that. And there are certain scenarios where it would make sense to me for you to learn Node instead of PHP. But there's also scenarios where it would make sense to me for you to learn PHP versus Node. In the end, I think you should learn both. But it's a matter of which should you learn first. And you have to be a little bit careful when you make that decision, because the reality is oftentimes the decision you make to in terms of what you're going to learn first, the reality is a lot of times we end up sticking with that particular language throughout most of our career. And so you don't have to do that, but making that decision can sort of send you down a path that will sort of dictate the rest of your career. So you really do want to think about this and which route that you want to go. So again, I'm going to talk about it from an employment perspective. I'm going to talk about it from a technology perspective, and then I'm going to talk about it from a career perspective to try to give you all the data that you would need to make a proper decision, and then of course give my opinion on the whole thing as well. Now, before I do that, I do want to encourage you to head on over to store.johnmorrisonline.com and help support the show by getting your coding training from there. As a regular listener of the show, you can get 20% off anything in the store using the coupon code JMO at checkout. You'll find my Upwork courses, my PHP course, my login script tutorial, my object-oriented programming course, some of my marketing courses in terms of getting clients and getting website traffic, and all that stuff is over there in the store, along with all the Udemy links, Skillshare links, etc. So again, I'd appreciate it if you'd get the coding training you need, but also help support the show and what I'm doing here. Again, the link is store.johnmorrisonline.com. Use the coupon code JMO at checkout for 20% off. All right. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in then to this question. So first, I want to start off looking at it from an employment perspective, because I think a lot of times that's probably the first thing that people look at is, am I going to have a better opportunity to get jobs and get work with PHP versus Node, etc. And the technology question is often, I think, secondary. So if we go over to PayScale, which I like using that site because it gives us some good data. If you look at a Node software engineer, the median income for a Node software engineer is $84,063 annually. And the median income for a Node senior software engineer is $116,000 a year. And I'm going to provide all the links for all the stuff that I mentioned here that I can over on the show notes page for this episode at johnmorrisshow.com/266. So if you want to actually look at all of this research and all this data yourself, you can head on over there in the resources section. All these links will be posted there. So 84,000 and 116,000 for Node. If we look at PHP, it is 76,599 for a software engineer, and it is 102,000 for a senior software engineer. So the median incomes for both software engineers and senior software engineers are a little bit higher for Node, which really isn't surprising. I think that's probably what most people would imagine. If we go over to Indeed and just look at the number of jobs available, for Node, there is 6,652 jobs available, and for PHP, there's 13,928 jobs available. Again, I think both of those sets of numbers probably are what you would expect. Node's going to pay a little bit more, but PHP is going to have more jobs available. So it's sort of It's sort of looking at it and deciding if you really want to go in and it's maybe a little bit riskier to go with Node because a little bit harder to get a job. But if you do get a job, you're probably going to make more. Whereas with PHP, if you just want to get started with something quick, there's a lot more jobs available, a lot more people that are probably willing to hire you and train you and teach you what you need to know as you go along and so forth. So sort of a decision along those lines. The other thing, though, that I think a lot of people miss when they talk about this stuff is that's just the tech job side of stuff. That's not looking at the freelancing part. And I think the freelancing picture is a big part of this whole thing. And just personally for myself, I can say when I got my first actual tech job, and this was years and years ago, so this was a long time ago, and I didn't know very much at that point. I would hesitate to even call myself a developer at that point, but again, I got hired, and I got hired at $30,000 a year. Now, we know in this space that that's really not all that much, and so that was that baseline as sort of a tech job. However, when I started freelancing, I was quickly able to surpass that $30,000 in my first year as a freelancer. Because if you break it down, it's about $2,500 a month in order to make $30,000 in a year freelancing. Well, $2,500 a month, let's say you're charging $50 an hour, that's 50 build hours a month. You can probably do that pretty easily. And if you take the other approach where you're not doing hourly rate, you're doing actual paid projects, the cheapest offering I had was $3,000 and I had a $5,000 offering. And so all I really had to do was get one project a month and I was going to be able to surpass what my income from the tech job was. So freelancing it's really easy once you sort of get it figured out to surpass what you can make as a developer getting hired at a tech company. So it's important that you look at this side of things and understand the market in this sense as well. So I went over to Upwork and just did some few searches. These are all in aggregate, so take them with a grain of salt, but it does give us a little bit of a picture. So if you look at the number of jobs that are available on Upwork for PHP, as of right now, there's 8,999 jobs available. If you look at Node, there's 1,213. So there's quite a bit from the freelance side, and Upwork is, I think, the biggest freelancing site on the internet. So that probably gives us a good idea of what the market as a whole looks like. There's quite a few more freelance jobs available for PHP. The other thing about that is there are other things that you have to factor into that. So for example, WordPress, we all know, is sort of a juggernaut in the PHP space. And so if you search WordPress, then you'll find 11,191 jobs. So there's actually more WordPress jobs on Upwork than there are PHP jobs. So if you start to add those up and maybe look at some of like Joomla and Drupal and so forth, then you start to see that the market for PHP over on Upwork in a freelancing sense is probably quite a bit bigger than what you would find for Node. If you also go over there and look at, I have a client account, so I can actually look at freelancers. And so if you try to look at what people are actually making, because the number of jobs is one thing, but what are people charging? How much are they earning, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did is I set the filters to find freelancers that had 10K plus in earnings, were charging 60 plus or more per hour, had 1,000 hours plus billed, and were independent freelancers, not agencies. So that sort of gives us a snapshot of kind of the top end of Upwork and the freelancers that are there. And so I set those filters and I did a search for PHP, and you'll find that there are 84 PHP developers that fit those parameters. And again, we could you kind of got to factor in, if we did WordPress, there would be some more, maybe some of them would be the same. So it's, again, you take these with a grain of salt, but it does give us a little bit of a picture. Doing that same search for Node, we find 27 freelancers over there. So I would say generally speaking that the freelance market for PHP developers is probably a lot more robust than the Node market is. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just the tech jobs and what you're making at, what pay scale says and Indeed and that sort of thing. It's also the freelance side of things. And I would say it just makes sense that PHP is probably a lot bigger in that area because of when we start looking at the technology perspective and the usage and so forth. That starts to make a little more sense. So that's the employment perspective. Now, looking at the technology perspective, one of the big things that we look at is just usage, and this is really probably the impetus for why the freelance market is a lot bigger for PHP. And that's because, and I've talked about this before, the usage for PHP is 83.1 of all websites whose server-side language we know. If you compare that to Node, Node's market share is 0.4%. So PHP just dominates in terms of usage. Another thing that you might look at, and this isn't necessarily an end-all, be-all. I'll link to this particular study that was done. You can look through it and decide if you think it's legit or not, but it seemed like this person was trying to take an objective view of the two different languages. And there's been a lot of talk about the performance of PHP and that sort of thing, and comparing it to Node and then multi-threading and all that sort of thing. So he actually sat down and ran the test to see what it actually looked like. And with PHP 7, because that's quite a bit different than past versions of PHP when it comes to performance. So he did the benchmarks and he ran several different tests, and PHP won when it came to concatenation of strings. I hate that word. Feel free to make fun of me in the comments. Everybody does. Anyway, wins in that, wins in filling an array, wins in filling associative arrays, wins in reading a file, and wins in MySQL queries in terms of performance, speed of being able to perform those functions. Node wins only when it comes to adding numbers, and those are just the tests that he happened to do. So there may be other tests, and you could maybe figure out, there's other places where Node wins and so forth, but it seems like a fairly strong win for PHP. He also tested multi-threaded tasks. This is kind of supposed to be the advantage that Node has over PHP is multi-threading. And actually, in his test, PHP won. So PHP was able to do 31,250 queries per second, whereas Node was able to do 5,000 queries per second. So that gives you a little bit from the technology perspective in terms of performance. One caveat to all this, though, is that if you, and this is why I mentioned this with the question, he said he had learned JavaScript and now was considering PHP or Node. If Node is probably a little bit, it almost certainly is going to be a little bit easier to learn if you already know JavaScript, because the syntax is very, very similar. So you have the advantage of having a sort of single syntax for both the client and the server side. So that's something to keep in mind with all of this. Also, sites like PayPal, Netflix, Yahoo, Groupon, all these sites use Node, and their developers sort of swear by them. When you start getting into those really high levels of traffic and usage and so forth, it seems like the experiences that these companies talk about, that Node tends to perform better at those high usage levels. So again, something to keep in mind. Finally, looking at all of this from a career perspective. So what I want to just give you here is to understand the bigger picture of all of this and realize it doesn't necessarily have to be a choice between Node or PHP. It's more about how do you go about building out your career. And my advice to you is this, and I talked about this in an episode I did in the past. It's learn to code these languages in this order. If you want to look for that on johnmorrisshow.com, you can find that, where I talk about what languages you should learn in what order, and specifically why I recommend those, and then the courses that I recommend you take along with that. But to go over that quickly again here, I believe you should learn HTML, CSS, then PHP and MySQL, then come back to JavaScript, and after that, then go into things like Node, React, Angular, Angular, etc. And the reason why I recommend that you do that is because those 5 core languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, and MySQL, they basically are what the web runs on right now. And the numbers bear that out. So if we go and again, we look at market share, HTML is run by 79.5% of all websites. CSS is run by 95%. JavaScript is ran by 94%. PHP is ran by 83%. MySQL, I couldn't find hard numbers on that one, but just my sort of intuition about if the PHP market share is 83%, a lot of PHP developers just use MySQL. I know it's not 100%, but I would say the MySQL market share is probably pretty high as well. So when you look at, when you load a web page on the internet, chances are that web page is being loaded using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, and MySQL. So that stack is sort of the web as you know it. So it only makes sense that you should learn those foundational languages and skills so that you can open yourself up to all of that work. Again, if we go back to the employment perspective, Node has a little bit of an advantage in terms of pay. But it's at a disadvantage in terms of number of jobs. It's at a disadvantage in terms of the freelance work that's available, et cetera, et cetera. So when you open yourself up to that core stack, you're sort of opening yourself up to the entire web and making sure you're a well-rounded developer that knows the languages that most websites are going to be running. And then from there, if you want to go in and specialize in something like Node or React or Angular or some other thing, then you can add that as a skill set on top. But I really, truly believe that to be a full stack, well-rounded developer, and I don't like getting into these purity tests, but I think in order to be that and open yourself up to the most amount of opportunity, you really need to know those 5 sort of core languages and then branch out from there. So to sort of give you the TLDR on all this, I would say that if you are wanting to go sort of the enterprise route, you're wanting to work at a Netflix or a PayPal and go into that environment, which is going to be, it is going to be a lot more competitive, a lot more high pressure. It's going to be more 9-to-5 sort of type day job, corporate, that sort of thing. If you want to go that route, which is entirely fine, then Node might be a little bit better route in that environment. However, if you want to go the freelance route and you want to sort of maybe start your own business, that sort of thing, I think PHP pretty clearly dominates that part of things. If you're looking at just getting a tech job in general, then again, you could really go either route. There are a number of PHP jobs, a number of Node jobs. It sort of depends. So I could see going either route in that case. Of course, the last question I think probably that comes up with all of this is how do I go about learning all of this? So I'm going to give you links to 2 different courses that I recommend for each one. The first one is my own PHP course, which you can find at johnmorrisonline.com/PHP. That's going to teach you all the basic syntax of PHP. It's going to teach you object-oriented programming. It's going to teach you working with MySQL databases, prepared statement, preventing SQL injection, building actual applications, professional level PHP applications. There's a login script tutorial, all that sort of stuff. If you really want to go all in and master PHP, I just truly believe that it's one of the best courses out there for you to do that. So again, that's at johnmorrisonline.com/PHP. For Node, there's a very good course over on Udemy. It's not mine, but it's got tens of thousands of students. I think the star rating is 4.6, which is actually really good for over on Udemy. And it's a really sort of full-fledged Node class if you want to go into Node. That you can find at johnmorrisonline.com/Node.js, all one word. And I'll link to all this stuff again in the show notes page, johnmorrisshow.com/264. So there you go. That's my perspective on PHP versus Node.js. Take that information for what it's worth. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing, don't get caught up in what's popular. Someone made a YouTube video that said, PHP is lame, or this guy wrote on a forum that Node is stupid, or Don't get caught up in any of that stuff. All that matters is you, what you want out of your life and your career, and doing what's best for you to get the things that you want, to live the life that you want to live, to have the career that you want to have. Nothing else matters. So do what is best for you in the end, and don't really worry about what anybody else thinks. All right, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode, I'd appreciate if you'd share it with someone who could benefit from all the information in this one. Also, if you want links to all the past episodes and the links to subscribe on Android, iTunes, TuneIn, all that sort of thing, you can find all that at johnmorrisshow.com. And finally, if you'll leave me an honest review of the podcast, I would really, really appreciate that. That's what helps me grow this podcast, so I'd really appreciate it. I will also give you Module 1 of my PHP 101 course for free if you'll do that. All the instructions for that are at johnmorrisshow.com. Simply click on the Start Here link. All right, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.